This is Steve Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Ling Chen. She is Assistant Professor in the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's also affiliated with my alma mater, Harvard's Fairbanks Center, as an Associate in Research. She is one of America's leading experts on the political economy of China, especially state business relations, as well as the politics of industrial and economic policies. So we thought she was the perfect person to bring in for the discussion of the upcoming Fifth Plenum of the 19th Party Congress. So Ling, welcome. Let's start off with an easy one. This was announced, what, about 4 weeks ago, that we were going to have the plenum within a week of right now. What should we expect from the Fifth Plenum of the 19th Party Congress?
Thanks very much, Steve, for the very nice introduction. And the Fifth Plenum usually has a key component, which is to pass the 5-year plan. And we expect that this year, the 5-year plan will emphasize economic security and quality growth. And when I say economic security, it really would be the highlight of the five-year plan, because China is dealing with a very challenging global situation, and China is faced with further decoupling of global supply chains. In order to manage the crisis and in order to further push for domestic development, China is likely to emphasize economic security through two components. The first is emphasize on domestic technology innovation. And the second is emphasize on domestic demand embodied through the so-called strategy of dual circulation. And further, there should be some mentioning, although I don't know if this is going to be the most important components, will be further mentioning of equitable development, climate change, and environmental sustainability. As far as the growth rate is concerned, the target growth rate is likely to be lower to 5% or even 4%.
Will they keep targets given what's happened in the first 2 quarters of 2020?
Well, they're still going to have a projected growth rate. They're still going to have a target. It's just likely that the targets is going to be even lower than the previous Fifth Plenum.
What about this talk of getting rid of a target? I've heard that every time it comes out every year. There's discussion, including amongst Chinese, of getting rid of the target because it's artificial and it doesn't deal with a lot of what you're talking about, which are qualitative, not quantitative developments.
Yeah, that's certainly is a great idea. And there has been a lot of talks in terms of recommendation of think tanks and policy circles, but I personally am not completely sure that such talks would be fast enough to reach a conclusion before the Fifth Plenum to have this worked out, and then they actually entirely dropped the targets. And after all, targets is also something that international organizations a lot of time look at to judge China's economy.
This is going to be the 14th 5-year plan, which they'll discuss at the upcoming Central Committee meeting. What happens to it? What happens to it subsequently? When does it finally become a plan? This is just a draft at this point, and are there really discussions about it? Are the people who say, "Oh, nah, this project in Guizhou is not a good idea"?
Well, this is actually called the proposal of the 14th 5-year plan. And the actual 5-year plan is much more complicated because this is more like an overall guidelines. Then after the overall guidelines and the proposals are discussed, they're going to implement it over the next 5 years, and many detailed proposals in different departments like the Department of Commerce, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Science and Technology are all going to have their own 5-year plans, and each local government's departments are going to have implementation details as well. So that's the what is actually come out of this 5-year plan is going to be look somewhat abstract, but it has a signaling effect overall.
When does it get finalized? Will it be finalized at this Central Committee meeting, or does it go on through additional drafts?
My understanding is it's not necessarily going to be finalized of the central this Central Committee meeting, and it still need to take some time to actually eventually finalize. And the process is going to be more of people discussing, the leaders discuss on the stage, and finally there is a passing stage that where everyone raises their hands.
Mm-hmm. Does Li Keqiang carry the burden because he's supposed to be in charge of this from a government point of view? Or does Xi Jinping carry the burden of kind of talking on stage and describing the plan?
Well, we expect them to both play roles, but just judge from the past 5 to 10 years experience, I think President Xi Jinping is likely to play a very important role.
And what's this dual circulation strategy that's been talked about in the Chinese press as of late and by the Chinese leadership?
Yeah, dual circulation strategy is a very interesting and timely strategy. It basically emphasizes both domestic circulation and international circulation. And for domestic circulation, it emphasizes using domestic market, domestic demands to stimulate further economic growth, and using domestic technology development to further combines the markets and the business. The international circulation is another aspect that China is not going to give up on or shut up from participating in globalization, and therefore China wanted to still continue to engage with foreign markets, foreign technology, foreign investment. However, the emphasis is really on domestic circulation. And this is, again, to deal with the challenges of further decoupling of global supply chains, and especially in face of situation that U.S. will further restrict the exports of technology components to Chinese domestic firms, and or whether there's another round of trade war ongoing.
The recent comments by a lot of the folks on the Standing Committee and the Politburo have talked about the very challenging international environment, and that they should not be relying on exports for domestic GDP growth. Mm-hmm. Are we going to see a return to kind of the days when I first studied China, 自力更生, self-reliance, which is really, I almost hear in this dual circulation strategy, it resonates with when I started Chinese, the 自力更生, the self-reliance principle.
Yes. So in this context, the translation or the narrative is more self-sufficiency or self-reliance, but I'm not sure, and I don't think it's accurate to understand it as China going back to, say, the Maoist years, where everything has to shut off from the outside contact, and China has to rely on its own to do everything. So China certainly wanted to be prepared for the worst situation. However, this kind of self-sufficiency resonates more with, for example, many years ago, the domestic or indigenous innovation paradigm, and also resonates a bit more with the overall turning of to domestic markets and turning to domestic industrial competitiveness. So in other words, this is not entirely new, but the emphasis on domestic demand is certainly more eye-catching. We expect it to be more eye-catching in the Fifth Plenum.
What do you make of it when they have these study sessions for the Politburo, which get which get put on television. So it's very interesting. You can watch the Xinwen Lianbo, the evening news in the morning in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you make of this? Like they had a study session, I think it was on quantum computing.
Yes, exactly.
What is, I mean, so the Standing Committee and the Politburo needs to understand quantum computing. Maybe I should attend that class so I can understand it. What is that about?
Well, yes, it's on the 16th, I believe, about 5 days ago. President Xi Jinping organized a connective study of the Politburo members, and they all get together and had a study about quantum technology. I don't think that every single member needs to actually thoroughly understand the technology, but the emphasis is really on the fact that and China needs to have breakthrough in this so-called crucial core technology. For example, quantum technology is one area certainly, but also chip making is another crucial core technology, which is 关键核心技术 in Chinese.
Yeah, so a core technology. Yeah. The goal of the leadership has been to have a moderately prosperous society by this year, by 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and eliminate poverty. Will they announce at this meeting that they have succeeded in doing that?
Well, in this aspect, I would be more optimistic and think that it's very possible they're going to do that, and it's possible they can reach their goal. If you look at 2019, that 1 year China has brought about 10 million people out of poverty. And then by the end of 2019, in December, there's about 5 million left. Even though there is a disruption of the pandemic, within the entire year of 2020, and now we're kind of coming to an end of 2020, it's likely that they are, even if they don't announce the complete of this task in the Fifth Plenum, they're going to announce that they are going to successfully complete by the end of this year.
And that means everybody's per capita income is more than 13 RMB a day. What's the standard?
So the standard, the international standard used from World Bank is about $2, $1.9 per day. However, China's standard is slightly lower if you translate that into year income. So the yearly income needs to be around 2,300 RMB. So, I mean, because if the international standard translated to yearly income would be about 4,800, and China used 2,300 RMB, so that the line of poverty is slightly lower.
So they'll announce that there's virtually nobody who now has income below that. And do you think it's true? Do you think it's true?
This is a difficult question, but we have to believe in the reporting of the localities essentially, and sometimes there could be, as we already know, for GDP numbers, for a lot of economic indicators, there could be misreporting or false reporting or exaggeration of numbers. It could be, but I think the overall trend should be that there's going to be significant reduction of poverty, especially given that. Given the past record and given the fact that e-commerce has emerged and a lot of the rural area and villages have been turned into the hubs of e-commerce.
In kind of preparing for this discussion with you, I tried to see what Western media has written about this upcoming plenum. There's nothing. But why? This is likely the largest economy in the world. This is the planning conference for it. Mm-hmm. Why is there so little publicity about it is part one. And second, talk a little about the history of these Fifth Plenums, which are, I believe, economic plenums.
Well, I believe I agree with you that there aren't as many reports that we would expect it. And I think the reason or probably because there are a lot of other things ongoing that in terms of U.S. China relations that, well, even trade war can be put aside, and the recent issues, for example, with WeChat and with TikTok, and there's also the recent ongoing issues with U.S. China relations in the new era if U.S. were able to elect a new president. So there's a lot of things on the agenda that grab people's attention. I guess that's part of the reason. Hopefully it's not because that China is trying to give us a surprise. Hopefully it's just because there's a lot of other dominating issues.
Well, that was going to be my next question. I guess we don't know if it's going to be a surprise. Is there any history of surprises at Fifth Plenums? Where number one, any surprise on the economic side? Mm-hmm. Is there kind of a black swan that mm-hmm. we're not looking at? And are there potentially non-economic issues that come up?
Overall, I don't think there's going to be a surprise. And the reason I said that is because China is already facing an unprecedentedly, should I call unfriendly global environment, and they know that. So I don't think it's in the interest of the party leadership to actually suddenly launch a surprise event at the plenum, because they already got plenty to deal with.
What about a positive surprise? So further, I always look back mm-hmm. to the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, which is now 7 years mm-hmm. ago. And that, when I read that report, it was a very positive surprise to me. I was pleased with the emphasis on market reform, mm-hmm. on having market being the leading factor in the economy, mm-hmm. and have disappointed over the last 7 years that the overwhelming majority of those reforms have not been enacted. Is it possible that the leadership has kind of recognized that and they're going to reach back and pull some of the reforms back into the pot for the 14th five-year plan?
Well, there is that possibility in the sense that nothing is impossible, but I think the possibility is not very high, and here is why. During that third plenum that you mentioned, indeed they have push forward market-friendly reforms, and against that benchmark, we would probably be saying there's still a long way to go. But it also depends on the different readings of the third plenum, because the third plenum also said very clearly that state-owned enterprises is the unshakable foundation of the economy, and the private enterprises are just complementary to the public ownership. And afterwards, President Xi Jinping has made several trips and again has emphasized that, for example, the party leadership is the root and the soul of state-owned enterprises, and their position is unshakable. So this is the first reason. But when we look at further the recent development, because of the global environment, there's also rising of nationalist sentiment in China among the population, among the leadership. Also, there is a recent trend of increasing the party's leadership, increasing President Xi Jinping's leadership within the party and in the country. So all adding up together, I think this timing might not be exactly right for having launched very sudden, radical market liberalization reforms. Having said that, I think that they are still going to have market-friendly reforms in the background, for example, creating a friendly environment for business operation, especially for foreign and private enterprises, and reducing the hassle that local governments over business. This kind of emphasis on 营商环境, business operating environment would be welcome, because China, after all, realized that they need private entrepreneurs and need private enterprises for both economic and political reasons.
History teaches us that economic reform, this kind of market reform outside of China and within China, creates a surge of economic growth that for 12 months, maybe it doesn't, it may actually create a drop, but then you get this real surge of economic growth. And I think there are people in the Chinese leadership who understand this quite well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the question is, can they persuade the Standing Committee, the Politburo, and ultimately the Central Committee, that in order to kind of satisfy the people of China, they need this reform, because ultimately they run up against the problems of state-owned enterprises, the problems of monopoly. You know, we know you focus on the political. We know the ROE of state-owned enterprises is horrendous. It's terrible, and we know that these monopolists. I always joke, you know, I loved being a monopolist when I was in private equity. It made my life easier. I could just go home and take monopoly revenue. So. Don't you? I guess my question is there a group in China who believe that in order to maintain the rule of the CCP, you're going to need economic reform?
Yes, I do believe there is a group. For example, Liu He, she's primary economic advisor, would be advocating for more market reforms, and I believe Premier Li Keqiang also tend to emphasize market reforms and less administration hassles and creating a more friendly environment for especially medium and small enterprises. I think my point though is that it's not true that after the third plenum that you mentioned that there's completely no progress. So there's less progress in the very top upper string, big, gigantic SOEs, state-owned enterprises. However, in the middle and lower string, they further allow mixed ownership. So in the middle, lower string of the production, actually there's more progress. And also there's opening of financial markets, formal opening financial markets for foreign enterprises starting April 1st this year. So there are some progresses, even though they might be limited, but I still think there is. And the good news though is that in order to further rely on domestic demand and domestic consumption, China still has to maintain a market approach that actually benefit the majority of population that they have to keep in mind in order to make the dual circulation strategy work.
Xi Jinping visited Shenzhen for the 40th anniversary. It brought to mind Deng Xiaoping's southern trip, where he then kind of fired up reform and opening. Mm-hmm. Any chance that this is what was going on when Xi Jinping gave his speech in Shenzhen?
So just to clarify your question, is it that what
is it a relighting? Is it his kind of statement that we're going to move more rapidly towards reform and opening than we have over the last few years? Just as, you know, Deng Xiaoping after June 4th, mm-hmm. you know, reform got frozen. So it was almost 3 years mm-hmm. until Deng went down south mm-hmm. And gave speeches, which were initially not reported mm-hmm. by state media because there was not consensus behind him at that point. But he announced we're going to move again towards reform and opening. And it took a long time for that to take hold. Is there some possibility that that's the case, or am I just the eternal optimist?
Well, it's certainly possible in the sense that China is currently emphasizing building domestic markets and making the market more transparent. You cannot have any economic activities working without a transparent market mechanism, and you have to remove those local barriers as well. Although we have to also not overread into that message, because President Xi Jinping also, for example, from time to time visit and have meeting with private entrepreneurs and emphasize the importance of private enterprises in building China's market economy, in China's market reforms. So so from time to time, the central government seems to be sending out signals, two signals. On the one hand, it's really unshakable that we have to emphasize the central role of SOEs, and we have to emphasize the central role of party leadership. On the other hand, we also wanted the support of the private entrepreneurs and the market-friendly environment. So there, this is, well, in my own concept, this is called dual signaling. They always do this dual signaling almost at the same time during various kind of visits.
Yeah, I of course can't forget that really one of the founders of Shenzhen was Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping's father played a critical role in the creation of Shenzhen. And how can a son go to where the father played a critical role in the creation of the place and not feel that? I guess I'm a huge believer in the apple never falls far from the tree, so that who the parents are is often who the children are. And when he goes to Shenzhen, when he went to, he could have chosen not to go. But, people just would have shrugged. But that he chooses to go, I think, is interesting. That he chooses to go before the Fifth Plenum is, I think, obviously it was the actual anniversary, but I think it's interesting. Is he secure in his leadership?
Well, first of all, I do not know if it's to judge whether he himself feels secure. I do not know his feeling. As far as the Shenzhen trip visit, I think Shenzhen does play a very important role in China's opening and in China's market reforms. And also recently, there is talks about the further development of the Pearl River data that connects Shenzhen and Hong Kong and the broader Guangdong region. So in terms of regional development strategy, I think in this aspect, the visit is really necessary. In terms of security of President Xi Jinping, I would, even though I cannot comment too much on that, I think that if there are challenges, the challenges are still going to be more likely to come from external rather than domestic inside China. And the reason I say that is because China has undergone many decades of different kinds of problems and challenges. And President Xi Jinping is a well-trained leader in this aspect, as almost every China's politician has gone through a lot of trainings and experience of these, and they come from localities in China. He was originally was in Zhejiang, right? So he has already faced a lot. Yet the international challenge that China is currently facing is unprecedented. So in order to deal with the international challenge, it's likely that the overall strategy is still to preserve this stability.
I was fascinated that when he spoke in Shenzhen, even though you have the quarantine rules in effect in China when you go from Hong Kong, he had quite close to him Dong Jianhua, Carrie Lam, and some other folks from Hong Kong, clearly within 6 feet, and they were not wearing masks. I found that a very interesting part of watching the televised part of his speech. What's going to be the effect of the plenum on U.S. China relations? What can we look for?
Well,
obviously it's 5 days before our election. So
yes. So maybe we wanted to do that all together. We have the Fifth Plenum and then the U.S. election. Then we know better where we're heading to. So as we mentioned, that a lot of these measures China are likely to take either at or after the plenum, or certain kind of response to the current global environment. Then if China can successfully implement these strategies, including the dual circulation strategy, its improvement of the institution for science and technology innovation, and all these, and creating domestic demand, if they can successfully implement the strategies, then China would significantly reduce its reliance on external and export markets. That also means that the U.S. strategy of weaponizing its supply chain because of its dominant role in the global supply chain is going to be less effective in this context. And not just China is going to rely less on this such supply chain, but as Chinese enterprises gradually climb up the supply chain, as we can see from enterprises like Huawei or ZTE, then it also means that for US, it's less likely for US to be persuasive to other countries to join United States in containing China. So I think that's the biggest implication for the plenum. Of course, we have to wait for the big election to see what's the influence of the president.
I mean, my hope is that the plenum leads to more reform, which creates a better atmosphere for U.S. China relations, whether President Trump is reelected or Vice President Biden is elected and needs to formulate a new U.S. policy towards China. That it's important that the Chinese understand that they can take lots of actions, in economic sector, in the human rights sector, in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis Taiwan. I could go on and on, which sets a very positive atmosphere for U.S. China relations as we enter this new period. Even if Trump is reelected, they will rethink what their policy is. Well, I started this by asking Professor Ling Chen why there's so little reporting on this in the media. So hopefully we have now succeeded in educating our listeners about what is coming up in the next few days in the Fifth Plenum of the 19th Party Congress. It will be interesting. I think it will be very important, and I can't thank you enough for educating me and our listeners about this.
Thanks, Steve. And let me emphasize more that U.S.-China relations, it takes two countries to make a relationship. So the U.S.-China relation, even though right now it's at its downturn, with the forthcoming of the plenum, and especially with the possibility of electing a new president, we will expect more mature policies, especially from the U.S. side. And with that, the China side response will likely to be also more positive, as both countries also have a lot to gain by nurturing a market-friendly environment, by further deepening reforms. A lot of the current reaction of China comes from the pressure the U.S. put on it, and also comes from the international environment that galvanized China, or even pressed China to take certain actions. So I certainly hope that after the plenum and after the election, everything will be back, at least back to normal, if not much more positive.
I don't expect back to normal, but I expect hopefully no matter who is elected, we're back to something that's more rational at least. But I agree with everything you said. Thank you so much. SAIS is lucky to have you. But thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. It's my pleasure.